So I would like to say on behalf of the American Sephardi Federation Institute of Jewish Experience and on behalf of the Rabbi Arthur Schneier International Program of Yeshiva University, we are very happy to have with us Lars Fischer for our New Works Wednesday. It's definitely a different type of one, and as he wrote in his book, actually, I just have to read this because I kept going back to it. This is not the kind of book that comes with footnotes. Working without them has been a novel, in some respects, rather uncomfortable experience. While this book is not a scholarly book, it certainly draws on extensive scholarship and thorough research. And if you look at it, it definitely draws on plenty of research. But I thought it was so interesting that it's a challenge not to use footnotes. And I think that also points to the fact of the scholarship here. So that the fact that it did make you uncomfortable, and yet it makes the book definitely more readable. If you were to have put in all the footnotes, I don't think I would have gotten through it all because it makes it a little less fun. Okay, but now we're going to have a little bit of fun seeing some of the pictures, understanding the story behind them. I definitely have some things I want to point to, but I'm going to definitely turn the camera and the microphone over to you. Just some technical issues. I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A throughout. I will try very hard not to interrupt unless there's a reason to. So keep in mind that I will be monitoring and answering if there's anything there. Your cameras and microphones will be off throughout until the presentation is over. Once the presentation is over, I do encourage you, please open your cameras so that we see we're not talking to a blank screen. We were just talking about that before, talking to a blank screen. But we are here and we are listening. And so please do, once I invite you to, please do open your cameras, and then I will call on you if you have questions. I will also read out any questions that are in the Q&A. So at this point, I would like to introduce Lars Fischer, whose scholarship and publications focus on the history and conceptualization of anti-Semitism, Jewish, non-Jewish relations, and Frankfurt School Critical Theory. He has taught at UCL, King's College London, and the University of Cambridge, and served as secretary of the British Association for Jewish Studies and councillor of the Royal Historical Society. And I don't know why I don't have here, you're now in Berlin, right? Yeah, and I had it and I lost it. Where are you in Berlin? Please tell us, because
Well, I'm now what's politely called a freelancer, and I run a little enterprise called the History Practice.
Perfect. I couldn't remember it, so thank you. Please do continue to throw into the chat who you are, where you're signing in from, and we will come back to it at the end. And at this point, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm extremely pleased to note that one of you has already seen that there's a typo in the version of the cover I've given you here. Be assured, on the book itself, in its printed version, the surname has been spelt correctly, as in correctly the continental European spelling with a C. If a publisher had come to me and said, what do you think of making a book like this? I would almost certainly have thrown my arms up in the air and said, no, that's a terrible idea. Where would you even start? And even if you found a good place to start, how would you determine where to stop? If you're going to make a book of about 200 pages, there's only so much that can go into it. It can't be comprehensive. It can't, even in any strict sense of the word, be representative, what you put in there. So what are the standards going to be, the criteria for taking things into the book, leaving things out? So it's, I guess, a blessing that I was in fact approached with a view to possibly acting as a fact checker for this book. And that had the great advantage that there was a stock of something already there that I could bounce off. And that's allowed me over time, and that's been quite an arduous process, which has taken quite a lot of time, to figure out a way of doing this, making a book like this that leaves my conscience intact and leaves me feeling that perhaps I have been able to put something together that is both informative, also entertaining up to a point, and also very thoroughly fact-checked. So a lot of research has gone into the book, not least because there's a lot of stuff out there, not least on the internet, with explanations as to what it supposedly is or where it supposedly comes from and what it supposedly means, a lot of which is simply not true and doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And there's a temptation, I suppose, to say, well, if this is going to be a picture book, then the pictures are the important thing, and we needn't fuss too much about the information we provide to explain or contextualize the images. And that is something with which I would have been extremely uncomfortable. But it also makes this, of course, one of the most uneconomical ways of working that you could possibly imagine, particularly in the printed version of the book, where text, the space for text is quite limited. And so you constantly have to make choices of what you can actually explain and what you can't explain, and what context you can and can't provide. So often you'll find perhaps 5 lines of text that have behind them 5 days of research, even though that won't instantly be recognizable. We've tried, so the focus was essentially on Europe. We've taken the liberty of assuming that the United Kingdom and Ireland still belong to Europe, even after taking back control. And we've included the Yishuv, Jewish settlement, both prior to the national movement of the late 19th and early 20th century arising and after. And we've sort of gone around the Mediterranean and included North Africa, which is a slightly trickier territory than the others. But of course, the more one looks into it, the closer to the clearer it also becomes just how intricately linked Jewish life in continental Europe and North Africa have been at various points. One thing I did, which I think worked relatively well, I decided early on to try and make the bulk of the book about material that readers perhaps have not previously seen and that they're not already familiar with. And so areas where there's quite a lot of material and quite a lot of already frequently published material, especially on Germany and Poland, Pale of Settlement, I've sort of cut that back to a minimum. And on an almost technical level, while I was putting the book together, I quite consciously went round the margins first before turning to Central and Eastern Europe, because I wanted to give myself a chance to present what I thought was worth presenting from the various areas, starting from Scandinavia all the way around to Italy and Palestine, Eretz Israel, and North Africa, and only then see how much space is left for the fields that have perhaps been belabored more intensively before. So in some respects, I came to appreciate the liberating effect of knowing that what was going to be able to, what I would be able to put into the book would only be a fraction of what one conceivably might want to be in a book like this if it had 12 volumes. It's a bit like a great opportunity to eat your cake and have it, because whoever might come along and say, yes, but why didn't you put this in, or why didn't you put that in, or why didn't you consider something else? I'm in a fairly good position to say, well, where would you like me to put that, right? I think I've already got a fairly broad spectrum of topics and themes included, and I would probably agree with you that it might be desirable to cover yet more, but it's just not possible to get it all into one book. Now, that in and of itself, of course, is not specific to this book. I think most authors, well, I mean, I think if you're writing a book and you can't find enough stuff to put into it, you might probably not want to write that book. But I think most authors who develop ambitions in terms of producing books will find that they have to make complicated choices, and that they can't put everything in that they ideally might want to put in. But we have a particular problem here, which is that the bulk of what is shown in the book has since disappeared, and it hasn't disappeared of its own accord. Most of it has been violently destroyed and erased. And that seems to me lends the issue of choices and what you can and can't show and how you show it a dimension that perhaps in other projects you wouldn't have. To give you just one example of many, Therese Rothhauser was Kaiser Wilhelm II's favorite Carmen. He first saw her in Leipzig. He arranged for her to come to the Royal Opera in Berlin. She frequently sang at court to the Kaiser and his family. And once she retired, she started teaching. And at the end of her life, she was deported to Theresienstadt and either murdered or perished there. So in the printed book, on numerous occasions, and in the ebooks that will follow, where I have slightly more space for text, this will be even more systematically the case. Wherever possible, I've tried to find out, verify, corroborate what has happened both to people, to individuals, after they were famous, if you like, or even if they were not famous, what happened to them once the Nazis dominated first Germany and Europe, and the same with buildings and institutions. Do they still exist? What happened to them? Where did they go? Who made them disappear, if they did disappear? To provide a bit of context, I just want to give you another example of the way I've been thinking about this. Many of you, I think, will recognize this as the famous New Synagogue in Berlin. Those of you who've been to Berlin or are vaguely familiar with it may well know that the brilliant golden dome on top of it, having been restored finally in the late 1980s and early 1990s, is a major, spectacular, splendid landmark in Berlin's skyline. And if you go to an averagely well-informed German minister or politician or instructor or editor and throw the J word at them, they will instantly come back at you with a picture of the dome and the new synagogue. Now, what they probably won't come back at you with are these images. And if you look for New Synagogue Berlin on Google, you will get lots and lots of shiny golden domes. These images you will probably have to look for, because of course, what's now called the tourist attraction of the New Synagogue in Berlin is the New Synagogue in Berlin minus the New Synagogue. In other words, the dome, in fact, is on top of the administrative building in front of the synagogue. And as you can see, what's also been restored and is still there is what used to be the foyer and the weekday prayer room. But the actual synagogue, if by that you mean the place of worship, where Shabbat and holiday services took place, is gone. And you can see at our end, looking at it, there's a sort of symbolic replication of the apse where the ark once stood. And what they're even less likely to show you are pictures like this, because of course, like most Jewish institutions in Germany, the New Synagogue has to be protected day and night, 24/7 by armed police. And I want to use this just to indicate how important I think it is that you can't just, if you like, present a big show of what there was without actually referencing where it's gone and why it's gone and who made it disappear. And that's why I've tried to balance this by pursuing, if you like, the fate of institutions, individuals and groups, buildings during the Nazi period. Now, I want to make another point while we're stuck with the new synagogue in Berlin. We all, those of us who know the building, refer to it as the new synagogue in Berlin. But of course, it was in its time one of many new synagogues in Berlin. And I'm trying to think of the equivalent. So this new synagogue, if you like, is the equivalent of the National Cathedral in DC, or St. Paul's Cathedral in London, or Notre Dame in Paris. In other words, it's not the new synagogue, as though there were only one and this was it. It is the one spectacular, almost ostentatious synagogue in Berlin with which the official community sought to make its mark on the city, on the cityscape. And there were, of course, at the same time, presumably somewhere between 80 and 100 synagogues in Berlin that most of us have never heard of and will never hear of. And I've given here a second example of a new synagogue, which was in fact put in place in what was built as a restaurant. It's in what was then a suburb of Berlin, which was also a nature spot. And lots of people came there on excursions and they needed something to eat. And there were a number of gastronomic institutions there. And one of them was later turned into a synagogue. Now, whereas basically everyone knows what the new synagogue in Berlin looks like, no one ever bothered to make a postcard of the Grunewald synagogue. The only reason we have postcards of it was because the person who ran the restaurant before it became a synagogue did lots of advertising and therefore had postcards made, various of them. And that's why we know what the exterior of the Grunewald synagogue looked like. Now, speaking of synagogues, here is a postcard from the 1920s of the Neolog Synagogue in Bratislava, now the capital of Slovakia, which had previously been Pressburg in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think you will instantly spot that it's very much in the sort of neo-Oriental, neo-Moorish style. And it's worth thinking about this. I mean, the same obviously holds true of the new synagogue in Berlin. There are sort of two ways of thinking about this. One of them is that by building synagogues that look Oriental, although I would put the Oriental in inverted commas, but that aspire to a certain catalogue of style elements that are meant to indicate a harking back to architecture in Spain when it was under Arab control, or what one assumed were representative Middle Eastern Oriental styles. By doing this, you were obviously setting synagogues apart, making them look different from other religious buildings, notably in Europe, churches. On the other hand, the reason, or one of the main reasons why this style was so popular was because Jewish elites throughout Europe, and the more acculturated they were, the more so, had a big thing about what they thought of as Sephardi tradition. And that included specifically what they imagined the architecture, Jewish architecture, to have been in the Iberian Peninsula under Arab rule. And so they emulated this. And the background to this is, if you like, almost a dichotomy where Ashkenazi, Eastern Central European Jewry is seen as uncultured, as backward, And it is assumed that it is so because it's segregated itself from its environment. These are very stark notions of what actually went on, and they're more polemical than realistic. Whereas the Sephardi Jews on the Iberian Peninsula went through a golden age precisely because they opened themselves up to the culture of their surroundings. So you get this strange double bind that on the one hand, by opting for this supposedly Sephardi traditional style, you're setting yourself apart in Europe, or in most of Europe, but at the same time, the ideal that you associate with this style is actually one of particularly strong acculturation to your surroundings. Now, if you look at the synagogue in and of itself, as it stands there at the end of the street, it's really quite an impressive building. Now, I also came across a postcard here that shows it in its surroundings, and I have on the whole made a great effort to try and find images of synagogues in their surroundings, precisely because it seems to me that they tell us something about the way in which Jewish communities were able to impress themselves on, to make their mark on their surroundings in the localities where they lived. And although it's not a huge building, it does clearly cut a handsome figure, shall we say, in the cityscape. But I was then somewhat irritated when I came across a postcard which we've actually used in the book, and suddenly there's this huge church seemingly right next to the synagogue. And I have to admit, being the cynic that I am, I initially thought, so the nasty Christians, having seen that there's now an impressive synagogue there, decided they must immediately build an even bigger church right next to it. But it turns out that the church was there first. It's the cathedral of Bratislava. And so actually the meaning of the image is immediately inverted. And I suppose the really interesting question is, well, why did they get to build a synagogue so close to the cathedral? And the synagogue in Bratislava was located roughly halfway between the traditional Jewish quarter and the, in total, 3 Jewish cemeteries by the river. And it is no coincidence that it is the Neolog, so in the wider sense of the word, reform, or at least moderate reform synagogue that was built just 2 houses down from the cathedral, because the authorities, none too surprisingly, had a preference for Reform Judaism as opposed to more traditional forms, including even neo-Orthodox Judaism. But the details aren't really what I'm trying to get into here. My main point really is that I suppose it's a point about the meaning of images, and the way that one image on its own might suggest one particular meaning, and the moment you contrast it and put that image into its context, meanings can change, right? Now, here's the great synagogue in Brussels, architect non-Jew, built in the late 1870s. More recently has been rededicated as the Europe a synagogue, which is supposed to indicate somehow the friendship of all European Jews and non-Jews. And when the Jewish community, together with the architect, submitted the plans to the Municipal Royal Memorial Commission to have it approved, have the plans approved, the commission complained that it didn't look oriental enough, that actually it looked so much like a church that really the community ought to get its act together and do something about it to make it look more distinct and more discernibly separate and more discernibly Jewish. Now, to the best of my knowledge, the changes that were made were relatively small. I would think that it's mainly the 2 turrets on either side they sort of have a resemblance of minaret. But I think one can still recognize that the basic design is essentially neo-Romanesque. Christian architects building churches had a big thing about neo-Gothic at the time. And so architects who didn't want to go down the Oriental route tended to go for neo-Romanesque because that was, if you like, properly European. It was not Oriental, but it also couldn't be confused with neo-Gothic. And they thought that was distinct enough, if you like, to set synagogues apart from churches. But the main point, of course, is that even when synagogues bear clearly discernible neo-Oriental or neo-Moorish elements, it doesn't necessarily mean that the community itself, the Jewish community, was hell-bent on building in that way. So communities also had to negotiate expectations, and in some cases, not just expectations, but essentially an order telling them to be more distinct and to be more Oriental. Now, one of the photos I'm proudest of is this one here. It's not, the quality, alas, is not very good. But the gentleman on the right is Charles Gerschel, a prominent photographer. And when it comes to postcards, photography obviously plays a fairly crucial role. I mean, not exclusively. Many postcards with artwork, but it's hard to see how the golden age of postcard would have got off the ground without photography. And it is so rare to actually be able to show a photograph of a photographer rather than just photographs by a photographer. This is in fact from a book that Charles Gerschel and his father, Aaron Gerschel, who had a prominent photography studio in Paris, made of the retrial of Dreyfus in Rennes. The quality of the book is pretty poor. I mean, certainly of the reproductions, as you can see here, is pretty poor. But anyway, here for once you actually have a photographer. And the family originally came from Strasbourg, and they had a number of photography studios in Strasbourg, in Reims, in Nancy, and the particularly famous one in Paris. And I was even, another thing I'm particularly proud of, able to find a postcard from Reims made with the intention of showing the theatre, but just as it so happens, diagonally across the street from the theatre is the Gerschel photography studio. Now, one of the things I try to draw readers' attention to is just how dramatically, with the rise of photography, our viewing habits have changed. Now, I should say that the book is very strict. I was very strict in saying we're only going to have postcards and prints. That's already two genres, and they each follow not the same sets of rules and standards. That's quite enough to be getting on with. But we're not going to confuse things yet further by having photos of any description, in other words, just snapshots or photos from photo albums and so on, with the obvious exception of photos printed in print media at the time, which I think clearly qualifies as a print. Now, of course, in the age of digitalization, virtually all of us have instant access to photography, film record of most things that go on in the world that are of interest to anyone. And it seems perplexing now to think back to an era when events were documented by artists who drew on the basis of reports they received what they imagined events must have looked like. Now, I think it's very hard to imagine any of us putting up with that if the New York Times or the Times of London or Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung started replacing photographs of events with artistic imaginings. It's all the more bizarre that quite often The captions tell you that the drawings were made from nature, and yet they differ quite considerably. So here we have a letter bomb going off in the Rothschild Bank in Paris. It was first sent to the Rothschild family residence and from there to the bank. Rothschild wasn't in, and his poor, long-suffering private secretary, Bernard Jotkowitz, was the one who got in the way of the bomb. Here you have the same phenomenon, 5 different imaginings of an assassination attempt of one of Dreyfus's lawyers, not himself a Jew, but as far as I'm concerned, if you're one of Dreyfus's lawyers, that qualifies as Jewish history. And again, it's hard to reconcile that these are all images of the same event, most of them supposedly drawn from nature. Now, here's another one. 3 different renderings of the inauguration of Zadok Khan as chief rabbi of France. And the reason this, you're getting a peek, a preview here of the next of the ebook on France, the first one that's soon coming out. What I find so remarkable here is that not even the architectural features match, right? Which one would have thought, I mean, that can't be too difficult. So just to give you 2 examples, this is the stall of the Parisian chief rabbi. So Zadok Khan was previously chief rabbi of Paris and had his seat on the left-hand side, and then he was properly inaugurated as national chief rabbi of France and then moved over to the stall on the right-hand side. And as you can see, there are some quite clear distinctions here, both in terms of the stall and also if you look at the steps, there's some differences here. So on the far right, there's some sort of landing on the way up. And again, here you have that same corner of the balustrade in front of the choir, with supposedly in 2 cases the same candelabra on top. So even details like that vary, and yet to people who lived at the time, this was the acceptable medium of illustrating contemporary events of importance. Now, here I want to make 2 points. One of them is the one on the left, is perhaps my absolute favorite in the book. It shows Polly Nathan's fried fish, tea and coffee shop in the East End of London, Whitechapel. And if we can believe the caption, the old lady who's standing there in the window is actually Polly Nathan. Now, Polly Nathan, in her own sort of way, was a prominent figure. On the other hand, she's perhaps not a prominent figure like a chief rabbi or a Jewish minister in a national government or a famous composer. She ran a fish and chip shop, albeit a very famous one. One of the big problems with getting down to, like, ordinary people is that it proves enormously difficult. So I've said before that I've consciously excluded photos that are just simply photos. I've made an exception for what probably were private photographs, but printed on postcard paper. In other words, the back of the photo is clearly laid out as a postcard. So presumably these were circulated among friends, family, relatives, and perhaps they were also sold by the photo studios. But the problem tends to be that you could easily acquire, I don't want to exaggerate, but certainly thousands of photos of people of which the vendors will tell you that they're Jews, which they may well be. And in some cases, as here on the right, there's no doubting that that's a young Jew. But you have no idea of the provenance. There are many cases where if you look at it closer, it's clear that they're not Jews, the people on the photos. The same, incidentally, also goes for quite a few postcards. So there is this sort of famous basic assumption: all Jews are elderly men with beards and hats. And so if the person in the picture is an elderly gentleman with a hat and a beard, then that's a Jew. And if the person doesn't have a beard and doesn't have a hat and is an elderly, then they can't be a Jew. Now, in the France book, in the second volume, that's going to come out a bit later, I've actually been able to get some images of a Jewish family where I've been able to corroborate who they actually are and where they came from and what happened to them, but it's extremely difficult. So I suppose Polynathan is just about the closest I've managed to come to a relatively ordinary person. In the case of the young gentleman, who I think it's fairly clear is a bar mitzvah, on the right, all I've really been able to do is offer some explanation and context in terms of the photo studio, which was one of the most important in the East End that produced the image. I've tried to make things a little more coherent by also pursuing a couple of threads. So, for instance, I've picked up on one of the lesser known, in the wider sense of the word, German Jewish department store chains, the Barasch department stores, who for some time in what is now Russia and Poland and parts of former East Germany had about half a dozen department stores. So I tried to tell their story. I'm particularly proud of this postcard on the right, which is a delivery van driving around Magdeburg advertising the 95 Pfennig weeks. So every so often the Barasch department store in Magdeburg would have what effectively today you presumably call it a $1 or £1 sale, weeks where basically everything in the department store cost 95 pfennigs, and they developed this relatively early on. So this became quite a popular thing in the late 20s and early 30s. Popular is perhaps not quite the right word, but given the amount of social unrest and poverty and destitution that began to spread in the late 20s and early 30s, more and more department stores tried to get by having these sort of special weeks or days where they sold things on the cheap, and Barasch was one of the pioneers of that. They also ran photo studios in two of their department stores, and this is the one exception I've made in terms of just pure photos as photos, but in those instances, whether the Gerschels or the Baraschs, where we're actually looking at photography studios, people who ran photography studios and made photographs. I've included some samples, and the Barasch department stores also have their own brand of shoe polish called Baratol. Some of you may know that there's also an explosive of the same name. That's obviously something different. Another sort of thread I've created concerns what was initially a novel and then became a play and then an opera and then was made into a film several times, La Mifritz, by an author duo, non-Jewish, Erkman Chatrian, which has virtually no content to speak of, but it interests us because it's essentially all about a rabbi persuading a member of the local gentry finally to get married, and the role of the rabbi has attracted enormous interest from various quarters, And the way that the rabbi moves, his relationships to the people in his environment show that he's well respected. So it portrays an extremely amicable version of Jewish, non-Jewish relations, which also came in for some measure of criticism because some people thought it wasn't really believable or authentic. And it became extremely popular. It even made it across the Atlantic. The play was performed in New York and other major cities. And again, this has given me a chance to have the play or the opera pop up in various locations. So the opera premiered in Italy and Portugal. One of the best known, most popular Portuguese actors loved to play the role of the rabbi. So again, it allows me to sort of draw a thread through various localities. And I want to close with perhaps another important point. There's a general, or at least I found myself constantly having to prevent myself from trying to ascribe all too much meaning to each image and to give the images also, I suppose, a certain amount of space. So I want to give you one example. There's an astonishing number of postcards of the sites in big cities or locations of interest where the synagogues feature quite naturally, and by the synagogues I now mean the big ones like the new synagogue in Berlin, feature quite prominently and as well the most obvious thing of the world alongside other prominent monuments. Now, I found that extremely interesting because on one level it alerted me to the prominent position that large representative synagogues had in so many European cities before, in the case of continental Europe, the Nazis came along and put an end to that. But I also started wondering what it tells us and what it doesn't tell us, if you like, about Jewish, non-Jewish relations and how harmonious they may or may not have been. Until it dawned on me that, of course, and this is going to make me sound pretty old now because postcards are now pretty much a thing of the past, but if you go to London or Paris and buy a multi-image postcard which may or may not have St. Paul's Cathedral or Westminster Abbey on it or Notre Dame or whatever, you probably wouldn't sit down and say, well, I think that publisher of postcards must have this or that relationship to the Anglican Church because he or she has included Westminster Abbey on this postcard with multiple images from London. And so, although it's interesting and it does tell us something about the prominent position of prominent synagogues, it's also important not to then sort of go over the top and think, so all these publishers of postcards who included synagogues must have had a conscious awareness at all, let alone some sort of madly positive attitude towards synagogues in order to include them on these postcards. And the other thing, of course, is that you don't want to end up, at least I don't want to end up, making a book that sort of goes apologetic and all into, look at all the wonderful achievements of the Jews. So we need some naughty Jews as well, right? And here you have one of them. You may think when if you just sort of look at it for a moment that you know who this is and that it's going to be Dreyfus, but it isn't. It is what I suppose one can best call the guilty counterpart to Dreyfus. So comes from a wealthy Jewish background, and well educated, is well on his way to making a good career in the Navy. His name is Ulmo. And he decides that he's going to blackmail the naval ministry into giving him, I think it was $250,000 francs, something thereabouts, in exchange for sensitive documents that he would otherwise pass on to enemy powers. Now, as it turns out, when he met with the man from the Naval Museum under extremely dramatic circumstances. It was a sting, if you like, and he was arrested on the spot. And rather remarkably, initially the public was really quite sympathetic with him for the simple reason that they figured out that he needed the money, A, to feed his opium habit, and B, to feed his mistress. And in fact, it was the mistress who had got him onto the opium in the first place. So if Ulmo was really guilty of anything particularly, it was his weakness in having let the mistress seduce him, both sexually and in terms of getting him into drugs. So it's quite a remarkable, I would have thought, quite counterintuitive response. And even Ulmo's defense initially decided it was going to go down this route and say, well, you can't really blame him because it's all down to his mistress, isn't it? And so the public rage mainly was directed against the mistress, known as La Belle Lisson, who turned up at the trial repeatedly, all dark and in veil, and who aroused a lot of misgivings because she was just too indiscreet. So mistresses had a prominent role to play in upper class French life, not least given that divorce was still pretty much a taboo. I mean, it was legally possible, but it was still very much a taboo. So it was not at all unusual for people men to have mistresses. It was not at all unusual for it to be known that they had mistresses, and it was not at all unusual for it to be known who those mistresses were. So it was a sort of hiding in plain sight regime, but at the same time, there were also very clear-cut rules what mistresses were allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do. And La Belle Lisson clearly didn't know what she wasn't allowed to do. And she, in fact, then tried to make money out of the whole thing. In Paris, she put on a show where she sort of created Tableau, showing scenes from Ulmo's past and his arrest and so on and so forth. And the tide turned against Ulmo when it became clear that he'd actually previously approached the German embassy and tried to sell them some documents. So in the end, he was put on trial and sentenced to lifelong banishment to Devil's Island, as was initially the case with Dreyfus. And they put on a degradation ceremony. If I go back for a moment, if you look at the print, this is from March 1908, so he was arrested in the autumn of 1907. So this is more or less at the beginning of the trial. And if you look at the background, you can see that he is imagining at the bottom what it's going to be like all on his own on Devil's Island. And at the top, he's imagining his degradation, and it's clearly modeled on Dreyfus's degradation. And I think the authorities made a conscious decision that they were going to handle this differently. Now, the anti-Semitic activists of various stripes, when this all happened, hoped that they would be able to pull off something at least as dramatic as they had done in connection with Dreyfus. But it turns out that by now, there was relatively little interest. So anti-Semitism played a role, but it was not a major role, much to the chagrin of the anti-Semitic activists. And so the degradation, in fact, took place in Toulouse, in the public, and one journalist at the time in the papers described it as the most joyous of southern French festivals and the most poignant of spectacles. So there seem to have been at least 10,000 people came to have a look at this. And for most of them, it seems to have been a light-hearted affair. Now, I'll give you a sneak preview, and with that, I shall stop talking at you. Eventually, Ulmo was pardoned and allowed to return to mainland France. So he came back and he had a look at it, and he did not like what he saw, and so decided he'd go back to French Guiana. So here's a little snippet from Time, under the heading France, Stupid Superiority. It's not entirely clear who is being accused of stupid superiority here. And it quotes Olmo saying, "I was a sleeper for 26 years, a man removed from the world," cried Monsieur Olmo. "What has pardon brought me? Am I favorably impressed by the changes which took place during my quarter century of exile? No. After 6 months in Europe, I depart forever. Oh, the profound, the illimitable stupidity of the human race, which believes itself to be so superior. What most strikes me," he declared as his parting shot on sailing back to French Guiana, "is a formidable weakness of the world spiritually, the lowering of standards of conscience and even of intelligence since I was sent away 26 years ago. You've lost your sense of values, you take quantity for quality, you think size is greatness." So those are my remarks. And I guess we'll now proceed to questions and discussion.
Yeah, okay, so first, thank you so much. You know, a picture tells 1,000 words, but when you hear the words behind it as well, there's so much more there. And so really you help the pictures come to life. So thank you. If you stop screen share, then we can also invite people to join us on screen. And while, please do open your cameras. We do know that we're going a little over time. I hope that's okay for everybody. If not, you can at least put in your question and I'll ask it, and you can see it on YouTube. You'll get the link hopefully tomorrow. Also, I just now got an email that we will have, for participating today, you do have an extra 10% discount off the volume. I did put it into the chart, into the chat. I don't know why I said chart. And you'll also get it in the follow-up email that will come tomorrow. So first, how about if we start with a little bit about your personal, not personal, but about your writing. How long did it take to produce this book, including research time?
Well, I guess in total, pretty exactly a year.
That's not bad at all.
Well,
it wasn't my question.
No, that's true. But of course, behind that are 20 years of study, teaching,
right,
reading, caring.
Right, no, that we understand.
And being a scholar who knows his way around and knows where to look for things and so on.
So on
that, I think note, I think that is actually an important point. I mean, my core specialism is anti-Semitism, right? Mm-hmm. Which is frightfully important and frightfully relevant and frightfully depressing and frightfully awful. And that, because anti-Semitism has nothing to do with real Jews, and it's it's something that people project onto Jews. You don't actually need to know anything about Jews to be a consummate scholar of anti-Semitism. But at the same time, I always felt that if I'm going to spend most of my life figuring out, to the extent that one will ever figure out, why my own forebears decided it was a good idea to murder as many Jews as they can and to destroy as much Jewish life as possible, that it might also be quite rewarding to spend some time on recreating in a reflected, careful, responsible way some of what was actually destroyed. And it's something that's also dawned on me over time, and also, it's a matter of decades rather than years. And this may be quite strange to think about from a US-American perspective, and to some extent perhaps even from a UK perspective. But in continental Europe, we are so used to Jews being such small minorities that it's very difficult to perceive and appreciate how much more diverse and colorful they were before they became I mean, they were always minorities, but not this small. In other words, you know, for a certain amount of, for a certain diversity to arise, you need a critical mass. And one of the things that has been irrevocably lost in continental Europe is that critical mass, right? And so Jewish life is so much poorer for it. Now, it's not a criticism. It's just a fact of life. And I mean, beginning simply with the fact that virtually every Jewish institution in continental Europe has to be guarded by usually armed police. Now, bad as it was in continental Europe, even before the Nazi period, just to, you know, weigh those two, you know, that would have been unthinkable. And so one of the things I've tried to do is get a sense of when the Jewish minorities were still so much larger, also, I suppose, more optimistic and more hopeful, and less traumatized, how much more there was compared to what there is today. And of course, that is looked at from New York. I can see that that might well be quite an alien way of looking at it, right? I recall when I moved to the UK in 1997, I went back to university and I studied history at Queen Mary in the East End. And so I'd walk around, and of course there are very few Jews now left in the East End of London, and most of the Jewish institutions have been abandoned. And so I walked around and I saw all these various buildings, which clearly were recognizable as formerly Jewish buildings, if you like. And I just stood on the street and started crying. Because of course, if you've lived in Germany, where virtually everything has disappeared, and it's all disappeared because it's been violently destroyed, it's something totally different when you're in the East End of London. You know, the people have all moved somewhere better, right? And coming from a continental European perspective, that is deep, unsettling in a good sort of way, but it's a profoundly different experience, right? From the experience of just this big shadow of destruction that hangs over virtually everything.
I did want to note, Jackie mentioned, I'm not sure if she's here anymore, but I do want to at least read it out, that in Los Angeles, her synagogue is guarded by armed guards. So it's not only in continental Europe, unfortunately.
No, I know it's becoming much worse across the globe, of course, but it, you know, in continent, certainly in Germany, it's been like that basically since the 9th of May, 1945.
Yeah, well, that's a given. I don't see any hands up, so I'm going to read another question unless somebody here, or actually a comment from Froma. And she was talking about, you had mentioned, oh, there, do you want to just give your comment?
Hi. Yeah. No, I'm very curious because I've been looking at the book. I'm hoping to purchase the book, but I'm a fine artist and I've been working a lot with postcards of Jews in the public domain that I've actually found to a large extent on Pinterest. And these are postcards of women in the Maghreb in North Africa. And I noticed that you did have, you know, quite a large section of your book devoted to that, but you didn't get around to really talking about that. Whether you'd like to say a few words, because some of the things that I have learned is, again, to your point, even though the labels might say Jewish or Arab or Moresque or Berber, in many cases, they may not be what it says they are. And in other respects, kind of an interesting thing that also in Orientalist art in Europe, this idea of the Jewess and sexualizing Jewish women, you know, was also a way of othering and making Jewish people kind of stand out as this other population. So I was just wondering if you wanted to, in a few words, address those postcards from North Africa and, the concept that also a lot of the photographers who had studios, they were French, and it had a lot to do with what they were doing in North Africa. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry that I somehow couldn't figure out how to get that in to the talk. So the first thing I would say, it is absolutely astonishing how awash the world out there is with postcards that either do or claim to show Jews in North Africa. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. So, I mean, in a sense, I always have these sort of two theories. If there are loads and loads of particular, loads and loads of copies of particular postcards out there, it seems to me that there are two particularly plausible but also contradictory explanations. One of them is that they were enormously popular at the time, and therefore huge amounts of people bought them and kept them, and they therefore survived. Or the alternative, and exactly the opposite one, is that they didn't sell at all, and that they were stacked away somewhere in boxes, and at some point someone found them and thought, well, I'll try and flog them, right? I'm as yet at a loss as to how one might find out which of those two it might conceivably be. They are also, compared to other postcards with Jewish motifs, dirt cheap, which suggests that there's not much of a market for them now. I think that one can say clearly. And there are, I mean, this was certainly the field where I was most out of my depth, if you like. So there are lots and lots and lots and lots and a huge amount of postcards that claim to show the Jewish quarter of the city, town in question. But of course, whether that was the historical Jewish quarter or the current Jewish quarter, whether it was still inhabited mainly by Jews at the time, or most of them, these are things. So, I mean, I've tried to be as transparent about these things as possible. I mean, all I can do is show what I've been able to find and how much I know about it. Now, it's also true that there is just a gobsmacking number of postcards available that have ladies, women, in all sorts of peculiar costumes. And this clearly, I mean, it's clearly a genre of orientalizing portrayals of women. And I suppose, I mean, one is tempted to think there is no such thing as progress looking at the world just now, but of course, in some ways, we have made a little bit of progress. And this whole sort of genre of, how can I put this? I mean, if you go to the Black Forest today, you will still be able to buy postcards of women in dirndls with these black hats with the red dollops on top, right? Now, obviously, you will never ever meet a woman who looks like that if you stay in the Black Forest for 3 weeks, right? You will only find them on postcards. And I suspect that virtually all of these women from North Africa on the postcards with the various conical hats and their various costumes, I suspect you would never have met one of those either. But there's this sort of sense of, they're a group, and a group has an identity, and an identity has to have a costume to go with it. And so these things sell. They were also, this much we do know, of course, meant to be PR material to get French, so mainland France, French people to go on holiday in the colonies. Or, I mean, they weren't technically speaking colonies, but in the protectorates and the territories that had come under French control in North Africa. And that they're sort of meant to show how you're going to have this other Oriental experience if you go there. Now, one of the things I did pick up on, so I'll say another thing, which is if you go looking for these postcards, it is astonishing that basically anything that shows commercial activity in North Africa is labeled Jewish. Even if it actually says on the, even if the caption actually says Arab market, you will find it catalogued under Judaica, right? That happens sometimes in continental Europe as well, but particularly in North Africa. So, I mean, with the women, unless it explicitly says that they're Jewish, I obviously wouldn't go near them. And as I've tried to show in connection with the headwear issue, it's also clear that most of these sort of headwear things were worn both by Jewish and by Muslim women. Right, so they're not a differentiating feature. The ones that are nice enough to look at to get on the postcard would also have been the preserve of wealthy Muslim or Jewish women. So this is absolutely not the Jewish woman. And by the time most of these postcards were made, people had stopped wearing the stuff anyway, right? So it really is very much a sort of imagined world that's being created there. And two things I've tried to do is to keep those sorts of images, the orientalizing types of images to a minimum and try to find more sort of genuinely everyday looking images. And the other is that I've tried, and I've made that explicit at one point, also to identify indigenous photographers. So they may still be French in the sense of being the children or grandchildren of French people who settled in North Africa, but some of them are also clearly North African by descent. And they're clearly keen to get away from the whole, me in my Sunday best costume, pretending to be somebody I'm not, and to actually make some real photos of what life looked like on the street, and also how different groups commingled. And I mean, the simple truth of the matter is that in many of the images, they're there on the strength of it being in what was traditionally the Jewish quarter. But of course, that by no means implies that everyone on the photo is now a Jew. So, we do the best we can, I suppose.
I do want to say thank you. I know Fruma has something else to say, so I'm fine with Lars and Fruma. If you want to stay after, that's fine. I just do want to tell everybody thank you so much for coming. And Lars, thank you so much for this wonderful, absolutely wonderful presentation. You had a lot of accolades in chat as well. And I know that people are very interested in the book itself. And like I said, I will be sending the link and the 10% discount and 10 reproduction postcards for joining us today. I'm not going to send you the postcards. I'm going to send you the link that will give you the postcards. Sorry. So thank you again. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow night when we have our follow-up with the Chabura on, or tomorrow at noon, sorry, US time, on the Rabbi series, the Sephardi Rabbi series. And after that, we wish everybody a wonderful Passover. And to do that, we have Rabbi Gabai on April 10th. And that I will be live from Philadelphia. So I'm very excited. I hope everybody joins us then, live with Rabbi Gabai about Passover. So have a wonderful Passover if I don't see you before then. And thank you again, everybody. And feel free to stay for the next few minutes. I just wanted to make sure to acknowledge everyone. And thank you, particularly those who opened your cameras. We do appreciate it. Have a great day, evening, wherever you are.
So Lars, I just had one other little thing to add to what you just said, and that is that in my readings and studies about all of this, basically a lot of those studio photographers had the costumes in their studios, and the people that are labeled as Muslim were probably not Muslim because the women would refuse to be photographed. And they could have been either prostitutes or actually Jewish women that were dressing up as Muslims. That's just what that's what I found in my research, but it's fascinating just to think about, that whole milieu where Jewish, Muslim, Berber, all of those cultures and the French culture mingled and intersected in many, many different ways. And, it's kind of an interesting time. I'm very, I'm fascinated by that whole, confluence of culture and living together yet separate.
I mean, one of the fascinating things I thought was, which sort of gradually, I was dealing with this headwear issue and trying to figure out what the hell is what and who wore it and when and why and why some different from other. And it suddenly dawned on me that actually the problem is everyone goes there, sees a particular woman with a particular form of headwear and says, this is the Tunisian Jewish woman with the Tunisian Jewish women's headwear. Not figuring out that probably in the next village, the Jewish women are wearing a totally different sort of headwear, and that it may well be that along the borders and that the territories have not always existed, and people just go and they look at the first thing they see and declare it to be the typical appearance of, whatever the entity is they're looking at, when in fact it's quite clear that that's just not the case.
Yeah, really fascinating. Thank you.
If I may say something somewhat related to your topic, I'd like to recommend a book I read last year called Dark Mirror by Sarah Lipton, Lipton. It's about 500 years of European paintings and the progression of how Jews are depicted from in the 1300s. Often it is headwear that's slightly different. After a century or so, it then becomes noses that are bigger than they had been previously or anyone else in the picture. All sorts of degrading, worsening depictions of Jews over 500, 600 year span. In many of the medieval paintings, all the Christians are looking up towards the right, whereas the Jews are looking down towards the left. Jews, suddenly there's money, purses hanging on their clothing. It's Sarah Lipton, Dark Mirror. It's a very, very disturbing book, but I recommend it. And as I said, it's related with the postcards in terms of how Jews are depicted.
Yeah. Sarah Lipton is an absolutely outstanding scholar. So, I mean, she's been working on this for at least a decade now, as far as I can remember. Mm-hmm. And one of the big problems, we had a little controversy about one of the postcards in the book, actually, on Facebook. One of the problems is that it's sort of one thing to say, yes, well, there's all these degrading representations. But of course, if we're going to get anywhere with understanding any of the dynamics of this process, it's only by figuring out, well, what exactly is it that's degrading, and why is this the way in which the degrading takes place, and also what are the gradations of it? Because of course, not everything is equally degrading, and I would even go as far as to say that not everything that others is necessarily degrading. So I had this problem in the Algeria section with a chap who seems to be really rather nice, who draws sort of comic strip-like things that show different inhabitants of Algeria making experiences, usually with some form of innovation or another. And his problem is that in order to show how he thinks the different groups in Algeria ought to be living together harmoniously, he obviously has to show the members of the individual groups as actually belonging to those different individual groups. And so in a sense, he has to caricature all of them to make it clear that that's supposed to be a Jew, that's supposed to be a Muslim, that's supposed to be a Frenchman who's come over from Europe, right? And so he clearly does other, but he others in his representation
Right.
in order to be able to draw an image of what he thinks harmonious cohabitation would look like. Right? We had this controversy about one of the portrayals of, there's one page which has got 3 images of circumcision ceremonies,
Right.
and one of them is like a photograph of a ceremony, although it's clearly been everything. It's awfully well ordered, and everyone's very well behaved and well dressed, and so it's clearly been staged up to a point. And then there are 2 caricatures, if that's the right word, and one of them is clearly meant to be nasty, and it basically shows lots of old ugly men trying to get at the poor little baby's foreskin. And the other one, although it uses almost the same elements of imagery, is clearly meant to be funny. And in that one, the baby boy urinates towards, right? And so we had the situation where someone felt that this humorous one was also degrading. And you could sort of, see both the degrading one and the humorous one have as a sort of the thing that immediately strikes you is that the Moorhead has a huge pair of scissors, right? And so you can look at it from one side and say, oh yeah, well, these huge scissors, surely that must be a critique of circumcision. And yet, if you look at the images as a whole, they're clearly quite different, right? And so to come back to what you were saying at the beginning, Sarah Lipton is an absolute master of sort of finicking out distinctions and differentiations, and therefore giving us a much fuller, much richer picture of these unfortunate traditions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Thank you all again, and have a great rest of your evening, day, morning, wherever you are.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
And
so
thank you,
much.
Adam. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Adam.
Bye.